Picture this. You're in a dive shop halfway around the world, excited for tomorrow's boat dive, when the operator looks at your regulator and says, "Sorry, we don't have tanks for that connection type." It happens more often than you'd think. The choice between DIN and yoke regulator connections affects way more than just how your reg attaches to a tank. It impacts your safety, your travel flexibility, and even which types of diving you can realistically pursue. My name is Marcus Okafor, and I've spent years diving in conditions ranging from tropical reefs to cold water wrecks, watching divers figure out this choice the hard way. You're listening to the Scuba Gear Lab podcast. Quick heads up before we go further. Everything you're about to hear, the research, the data, the advice, is written and verified by real people with actual diving experience. The voice delivering it to you happens to be AI generated, but the content itself is entirely human. Just wanted to be upfront about that. If you've been listening to the show for a while, thank you for being here. Means a lot that you keep coming back. And if this is your first episode, welcome aboard. We release new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, breaking down scuba gear in ways that actually make sense when you're trying to spend your money wisely. Today, we're tackling a question that trips up a lot of divers: DIN versus yoke regulator connections, and how to figure out which one fits your diving. Let's get into it. I've watched more than a few divers struggle with this decision in dive shops from Cozumel to Komodo, and I get it. The DIN versus yoke regulator question seems technical and maybe a little intimidating when you're still working on your buoyancy. But here's the truth. This choice affects your safety, your travel logistics, and how your regulator performs at depth. Whether you're buying your first reg or upgrading from rental gear, understanding these two valve connection systems will help you make a decision that matches your actual diving plans, not just what looks cool in the shop. In this guide, I'll walk you through exactly what differentiates DIN from yoke connections, how to evaluate which system fits your diving style, and what you need to know before making the switch. We'll cover the mechanical differences, real-world performance considerations, and the practical realities of tank availability worldwide. By the end, you'll know which connection type deserves a spot in your gear bag. This is beginner-friendly content, no prior technical knowledge required. It'll take about 12 minutes to get through, and you can apply this information immediately to your next regulator purchase or conversion. To make an informed decision about your regulator connection type, you should have a clear picture of your diving plans and goals. Are you sticking with recreational diving, or do you have technical aspirations? What destinations do you dive most often, and what depth ranges are you working within? You'll also want to know what your local dive shop stocks in their rental tank inventory. Call ahead and ask what valve types they have available. If you're upgrading or converting an existing regulator, know your current specs. Budget awareness matters too. DIN regulators typically run around $25 to $75 more than yoke equivalents, plus any conversion costs down the line. And be honest about your certification level. Are you working within recreational certifications, or are you pursuing technical training? Optional but helpful, have a conversation with your regular dive operator about their tank inventory, get access to manufacturer specifications for regulators you're considering, and maybe pick up a DIN to yoke adapter or vice versa if you want flexibility. Those adapters typically run around $30 to $60. Now, let's talk about how each connection system actually works, because the mechanical difference between DIN and yoke regulator connections matters more than most new divers realize. A yoke connection, also called an A-clamp or INT system, uses a metal clamp that wraps over the tank valve pillar and tightens with a hand screw. The O-ring sits in a groove on the tank valve itself, and when you tighten the yoke screw, it presses the regulator inlet against that O-ring to create the seal. This system has been around since recreational diving began and remains the most common connection type worldwide, particularly in tropical resort destinations. A DIN connection, that stands for Deutsches Institut für Normung, the German standards organization that created it, threads the regulator directly into the valve opening. The O-ring sits in a groove on the regulator first stage itself, not the tank valve. As you hand-thread the DIN connector into the valve, it creates a captured seal inside the valve body. This design comes in two pressure ratings: 200 bar DIN, rated to approximately 3,000 psi with 5 threads, and 300 bar DIN, rated to approximately 4,500 psi with 7 threads. Most recreational DIN regulators use the 200 bar standard. I've used both systems extensively, and here's what actually happens underwater. The DIN connection places the O-ring in a more protected position. On a yoke system, that O-ring sits exposed on the tank valve, where it's vulnerable to impact if you bump your first stage against a wreck or cave ceiling. I once had a yoke O-ring partially dislodged during a drift dive in Cozumel when my first stage contacted the reef. Not a catastrophic failure, but definitely a reminder that the seal point is exposed. With DIN, that O-ring is recessed inside the valve body and captured between metal surfaces, making mechanical failure from impact significantly less likely. Moving on to evaluating your typical diving environment and depth range. Your actual diving habits should drive this decision more than abstract preferences or what your instructor uses. For tropical vacation diving and recreational depths, 0 to 100 feet, yoke connections work perfectly well and offer the significant advantage of universal availability. Every Caribbean resort, Southeast Asian dive shop, and Mediterranean operator I've visited in the past decade has predominantly yoke valves on their rental tanks. If you're diving 2 to 3 times per year on vacation and staying within recreational depth limits, a yoke regulator eliminates the hassle of adapters and special requests. For cold water diving, deeper recreational diving, and technical training, DIN connections provide measurable advantages. The more secure connection becomes important when you're dealing with higher gas densities at depth, where even small leaks become more problematic. I've taught courses in 45-degree water in the Pacific Northwest, and when a yoke connection develops even a minor leak at depth, the escaping bubbles can freeze and cause the regulator to free flow. The captured O-ring design in DIN systems reduces this risk significantly. For technical diving and depths beyond 130 feet, DIN becomes essentially mandatory. The 300 bar DIN standard supports the higher fill pressures commonly used in technical diving. I regularly dive with tanks filled to 3,600 psi or higher. Beyond the pressure rating, the more robust connection provides peace of mind when you're managing multiple stage bottles, long decompression obligations, and overhead environments where equipment reliability isn't optional. Consider this real-world example. I've logged about 200 dives in Roatan, Honduras, quintessential Caribbean vacation diving, and literally every single resort tank had yoke valves. Then I spent 2 months diving in Norway and Finland, where every tank at every technical dive center had DIN valves. Your geographic diving reality matters more than theoretical performance advantages. If you're genuinely unsure about your diving trajectory, here's my practical advice. Start with a quality regulator system that matches where you are now, not where you might be in 5 years. You can convert or adapt later if your diving evolves. Next up, you need to assess tank valve availability in your regular dive locations. This step requires actual research, not assumptions. Call or email the dive operators you use most frequently and ask a simple question. What percentage of your rental tanks have DIN valves versus yoke valves? In my experience training divers and working with shops across 6 continents, here's the general pattern. Yoke-dominant regions include Caribbean islands and Mexico, 95% or more yoke, Southeast Asian resort destinations like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, 90% plus yoke, Mediterranean tourist areas around 80% yoke, Australian Great Barrier Reef operators around 85% yoke, and beginner-focused dive centers globally. DIN-dominant or DIN-friendly regions include European cave and wreck diving sites, 80% plus DIN, Cold water technical diving locations like the Great Lakes, Scandinavia, Pacific Northwest, purpose-built technical diving operations anywhere, and South African and Red Sea technical dive centers. Mixed availability shows up in places like Florida Cave Country, where most operators stock both, Southern California, where larger shops maintain both, and UK and Ireland diving, which is transitional and increasingly DIN. Here's what the manufacturer claims about adapters solving this problem, and here's what actually happens at depth. Yes, you can use a DIN to yoke adapter that threads onto your DIN regulator, allowing it to connect to yoke valves. I carry one when I travel to yoke-dominant regions with my DIN regulators. They work, but they add a failure point, increase the profile of your first stage, making it more likely to bump into things, and occasionally cause confusion with less experienced dive masters who aren't familiar with them. Conversely, you can install a yoke to DIN conversion kit on many tank valves, but good luck finding a resort willing to modify their rental tanks for your convenience. Some technical divers travel with their own DIN valve inserts, but this requires compatible valve types and creates logistics headaches. The bottom line, if you're diving in DIN-dominant areas or own your own tanks, DIN makes perfect sense. If you're a vacation diver who rents equipment, forcing yourself to use adapters on every dive gets old fast. Now let's consider your future diving aspirations and training path. I remember clearly when I was a newly certified open water diver, convinced I'd never need anything beyond basic recreational equipment. Fast forward 3 years, and I was enrolled in my first technical diving course, wishing I'd made different gear choices from the start. Be honest with yourself about these questions. Are you interested in wreck penetration, cave diving, or deep diving beyond 100 feet? These disciplines strongly favor or require DIN connections. Every cold water regulator designed for serious technical diving comes standard with DIN fittings because the performance advantages matter when you're 200 feet inside a shipwreck with mandatory decompression obligations. Do you plan to pursue professional dive training, dive master, instructor? Working dive professionals benefit from DIN's reliability because you're making hundreds of dives per year, often in varying conditions. But if you'll be teaching predominantly at tropical resorts, yoke compatibility with the rental fleet may matter more. Are you building a long-term equipment set or buying your first regulator to supplement rentals? If you're investing in a high-end regulator that you plan to use for a decade, choosing the connection type that matches your 5-year diving vision makes more sense than optimizing for tomorrow's shore dive. What's your home diving environment? If you live in Florida, California, or anywhere with an active technical diving community, local tank availability probably includes plenty of DIN options. If you're landlocked and travel exclusively to Caribbean resorts, that calculation changes. I've watched divers spend around $800 on a high-performance regulator with a yoke connection because that's what my instructor recommended, only to convert it to DIN a year later when they discovered technical diving. That conversion typically costs around $150 to $200 and requires sending the regulator to a service center. Just food for thought. Let's talk about the practical differences in installation and use. The DIN versus yoke regulator debate isn't just about performance, it's about the actual experience of assembling your gear before every dive. Installing a yoke regulator works like this. Position the yoke clamp over the tank valve pillar, hand tighten the yoke screw until snug, finger tight plus about a quarter turn. Total time is 5 to 10 seconds, and you don't need any tools. This simplicity explains why yoke connections dominate beginner-focused operations. I've watched divers with limited hand strength or dexterity struggle with other equipment, but virtually everyone can tighten a yoke screw. The visual confirmation that it's properly seated, you can see the clamp wrapped around the valve, provides psychological comfort for newer divers. Installing a DIN regulator goes like this. Align the emlet with it with the tank valve opening, hand thread the DIN connector clockwise into the valve, that's 5 to 7 full rotations depending on pressure rating, Tighten until you feel firm resistance, hand tight with no tools. Total time is 10 to 15 seconds. The threading process requires a bit more attention. You need to start the threads straight to avoid cross-threading. I've seen rushed divers cross-thread DIN connections, which can damage both the regulator and valve threads. However, once you've done it a dozen times, it becomes second nature and actually feels more secure than yoke installations because you can feel the engagement of multiple threads. The practical reality? DIN connections take slightly longer to install and require more care, but provide a more positive, secure feeling once properly threaded. Yoke connections are faster and more intuitive for beginners, but require checking that the O-ring is properly seated. I always visually inspect the tank valve O-ring before mounting a yoke regulator. It's exposed and can be damaged or missing entirely. One often overlooked advantage of DIN: you control the O-ring. With yoke, you're trusting that the rental tank has a good O-ring in place. I've aborted dives because rental tank O-rings were damaged, extruded, or missing entirely. With DIN, the O-ring lives on your regulator, where you maintain it according to proper service schedules. Next, let's calculate the real costs of each option, because the price difference between DIN and yoke regulator systems affects your budget in several ways. For initial purchase price difference, entry-level regulators see DIN versions typically costing around $25 to $50 more than yoke equivalents. Mid-range regulators show DIN versions typically costing around $40 to $75 more. High-end regulators narrow the price difference to around $30 to $50, and DIN becomes standard at this level. For example, a popular beginner regulator might retail at around $399 for yoke, around $439 for DIN. At the high end, many manufacturers offer DIN as standard with a free yoke conversion kit included. Conversion costs, if you change your mind later, run like this. Yoke to DIN conversion kit costs around $120 to $180 for parts, plus around $50 to $80 labor. DIN to yoke conversion kit runs around $80 to $120 for parts, plus around $50 to $80 labor. Total conversion cost ends up around $170 to $260, depending on regulator model and service center. Adapter costs, if you want flexibility, DIN to yoke adapter runs around $30 to $60. That allows a DIN reg to connect to a yoke valve. Yoke to DIN adapter, which is a valve insert, costs around $40 to $70 and converts a yoke valve to accept a DIN reg. Long-term value consideration, DIN regulators typically hold resale value slightly better in the used market, particularly for high-end and technical diving models. If you decide technical diving isn't for you, selling a DIN regulator to the tech diving community is generally easier than finding buyers for technical capable yoke regulators. My practical recommendation: if the price difference is less than $50 and you have any interest in advancing beyond basic recreational diving, choose DIN. If the price difference is $100 or more and you're honestly a vacation diver who values simplicity and universal compatibility, yoke makes perfect sense. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're choosing inferior equipment by selecting yoke for the right reasons. Now it's time to make your decision based on your actual diving profile. You understand the technical differences, availability issues, and cost factors. Here's how to make a decision that actually fits your diving life. Choose yoke if you dive primarily on tropical vacations at resorts. You're buying your first regulator and staying within recreational limits. You value simplicity and universal tank compatibility. Your local dive shop predominantly rents yoke tanks. You have no near-term interest in technical diving training, or you want the lowest initial cost. Choose DIN if you're pursuing or planning technical diving training. You regularly dive in cold water or below 100 feet. You own your own tanks so you can choose valve types. Your local diving community is technical-oriented with DIN tank availability. You want the most secure connection and recessed O-ring protection, or you're buying a high-end regulator as a long-term investment. Choose DIN with an adapter if you dive locally in DIN-dominant areas but travel to yoke-dominant destinations. You want the technical advantages of DIN but need occasional yoke compatibility, or you're willing to carry an extra piece of equipment and add setup time. I personally dive DIN regulators exclusively now because my diving centers around cold water, wrecks, and technical profiles. But I dove yoke regulators happily for my first 5 years of diving, when I was primarily a Caribbean vacation diver. Neither choice is wrong. Just make sure it matches where you actually dive, not where you fantasize about diving. Let me share some pro tips from over 3,000 dives, along with common mistakes to avoid. Always carry spare O-rings for your connection type. For DIN regulators, this means carrying 2 to 3 spare O-rings sized for your first stage, typically 2-010 Bunanan. For yoke, carry tank valve O-rings, typically 2-012 or 2-014. I've saved more than a few dives, mine and other divers, by having the right O-ring in my Save a Dive kit. If using a DIN to yoke adapter, apply a tiny amount of silicone grease to the adapter threads, not the sealing surfaces, to ensure smooth installation and removal. Adapters can corrode into place in saltwater environments if you're not careful with rinsing and occasional maintenance. Don't over-tighten either connection type. Both yoke and DIN connections seal with O-ring compression, not thread torque. Hand tight is sufficient. I've seen divers use tools to over-tighten yoke screws, which damages the tank valve pillar and makes removal difficult. For DIN, stop when you feel firm resistance. You're not trying to prove your grip strength. Common mistakes to avoid. Assuming all DIN is the same. The 200-bar 5-thread and 300-bar 7-thread DIN standards are different. A 300-bar DIN regulator will thread into a 200-bar valve, but only the first 5 threads engage. This works, but isn't ideal. A 200-bar DIN regulator won't fully thread into a 300-bar valve, leaving it protruding dangerously. Always know which DIN standard your regulator uses and match it to appropriate valves. Forgetting to check O-ring condition before installation. This is particularly critical with yoke connections, where the O-ring lives on the tank valve. I do a visual and tactile inspection of every tank valve O-ring before installing my yoke regulator, looking for cracks, flat spots, extrusion, or debris. A damaged O-ring can cause anything from a minor leak to a catastrophic failure. Assuming DIN is inherently better regardless of context. I've met technical diving enthusiasts who insist DIN is superior in all situations, but if you're making 20 vacation dives per year in Bonaire, the practical advantages don't outweigh the convenience disadvantage. Choose based on your reality, not diving tribalism. Cross-threading DIN connections by rushing. Take the extra 3 seconds to start the threads carefully and ensure they're engaging smoothly. Cross-threaded regulators and valves require expensive machining repairs or replacement. If you feel unusual resistance when threading a DIN connection, back it out and start again. Let's hit some frequently asked questions. Can I convert my yoke regulator to DIN later if I want to? Yes, most modern regulators can be converted between yoke and DIN using manufacturer-specific conversion kits that typically cost around $120 to $180 plus installation labor. The conversion replaces the connection hardware on your first stage and requires professional service by a qualified technician. However, not all older regulator models have conversion options available, so check with your manufacturer before purchasing if you think you might convert later. The process takes about an hour in a service center and should be combined with your regular regulator service interval for cost efficiency. Are DIN connections really safer than yoke connections? DIN connections provide marginal safety advantages through a more secure captured O-ring design that's less vulnerable to impact damage and dislodgement compared to the exposed O-ring position on yoke valves. The threaded engagement also creates a more positive lock that's less likely to separate under stress. However, both connection types have excellent safety records when properly maintained and installed. The vast majority of recreational diving worldwide happens safely on yoke connections. The safety difference becomes more relevant in technical diving scenarios involving higher pressures, extreme environments, and depths where equipment redundancy and reliability are critical. Do DIN regulators perform better at yoke regulators at depth? No. The connection type doesn't directly affect regulator breathing performance, intermediate pressure delivery, or air consumption. Both DIN and yoke connections simply provide the high-pressure seal between your tank and first stage. What happens after that depends entirely on your regulator's internal design, balancing system, and adjustment characteristics. The performance advantage of DIN is about connection security and O-ring protection, not breathing effort or gas delivery. You can find high-performing and poorly performing regulators with both connection types. What happens if I show up at a dive shop with a DIN regulator and they only have yoke valves? You have three options. Use a DIN to yoke adapter, a threaded sleeve that converts your DIN connection to interface with yoke valves, which costs around $30 to $60 and should be part of your kit if you travel with DIN regulators. Request that the dive shop install DIN valve inserts in their tanks. Some technical-friendly shops maintain these, but most resort operations won't accommodate this. Or rent a complete regulator setup from the dive shop. I always travel with a DIN to yoke adapter when visiting yoke-dominant regions. It solves the problem in about 30 seconds, though it does add bulk to your first stage and creates an additional connection point to maintain. Let me wrap this up. The DIN versus yoke regulator question ultimately comes down to honest self-assessment of your diving patterns, aspirations, and typical environments. Yoke connections offer simplicity, universal availability, and lower initial costs. They're the practical choice for recreational vacation divers and beginners building their first equipment set. DIN connections provide superior security, protected O-ring positioning, and higher pressure ratings that matter for technical diving, cold water use, and depths beyond recreational limits. Neither system is universally superior. Context determines the right choice. A DIN regulator with an adapter provides maximum flexibility if you dive in varied locations. A yoke regulator gets you diving everywhere with zero complications. Make your decision based on where you actually dive most frequently, not on theoretical advantages or what seems more professional. Remember that you're choosing a connection type, not defining your diving identity. Your actual skills, training, and experience underwater matter infinitely more than whether you twist or clamp your regulator onto the tank. Choose what works for your diving reality, maintain it properly, and focus your energy on becoming a better diver regardless of which threads or clamps you're using. That wraps up this episode of the Scuba Gear Lab podcast. Thanks for spending part of your day listening. We drop new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so you've always got something fresh to dig into. If this episode helped you out, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a 5-star rating and write a quick review. That's genuinely how other divers find the show. It pushes us up in the search rankings and helps people who are searching for honest gear advice actually discover us. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe or follow so you get notified the second a new episode goes live. Catch you on the next one.